Sweetwater Valley, Nevada, August, 1878. The sun was a hammer over the Great Basin, beating the scent of sagebrush from the cracked earth. Most men were haying in the irrigated bottoms or resting in the slivers of shade cast by their log cabins, but one man was working in the open, on a ruin. The structure was a ghost of the Pony Express, a derelict relay station abandoned almost 2 decades prior. Its low, thick walls of earth had slumped and eroded, leaving it looking more like a geographic feature than a building. Inside this crumbling rectangle of dirt, Kazimierz Wojtkiewicz moved with a quiet, steady rhythm. He wasn't tearing it down, he was building it up. With a heavy wooden tamper, he pounded a mixture of clay, sand, and straw into large wooden forms set atop the existing walls. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was dull, primitive, carrying little distance in the vast, silent valley. Pemberton Stoddard, the freight agent from the rail spur down the valley, reined in his horse, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a man who understood schedules, lumber manifests, and the reliable geometry of milled timber. He saw none of that here. With him was Jedediah Coombs, a logger whose entire life was predicated on the belief that the only proper wall was made of felled trees. "Still at it, Wojtkiewicz?" Stoddard called out, his voice edged with the dry authority of his station. "You mean to put your family in that mud pile before the first snow?" Kazimierz paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a clay-caked hand. He gave a short nod. Coombs spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "It's a fool's errand. Those stations were abandoned for a reason. They melt. Come the spring runoff, your wife will be sleeping in a puddle. It's a gopher mound, not a house." He gestured with his chin toward the distant peaks of the Desatoya Mountains. "There's good timber up there. Build a proper cabin, man. A Christian cabin." The men who gathered at the freight depot had already passed their judgment. They called him the mud dauber, the Pole who lives in a hole. The consensus was that the man was crazy, driven mad by his first brutal Nevada winter. He was taking a structure literally abandoned as unfit for man or beast and trying to call it home. It was worse than foolish. It felt like an insult to the hard-won craft of frontier building. What did this Galician Pise builder, a man from the forested hills of the Carpathians, understand about the physics of survival in the high, dry desert that these seasoned frontiersmen, men who lived by the saw and the axe, had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of forgotten builders. The story of Kazimierz Wojtkiewicz is more than just a tale of stubbornness. It's a masterclass in a thermal principle that modern engineering is only just rediscovering. If you stay with us, I promise you will learn how a 22-inch wall of simple earth can outperform a foot of solid timber by not fighting the cold, but by slowing down time itself. Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used for a home? Kazimierz Wojtkiewicz was not a frontiersman. He was not a logger, a farmer, or a trapper. In his homeland of Galicia, a province of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth then under Austrian rule, he was a builder of a very specific kind. His hands knew the heft and feel of clay, the binding strength of long-stemmed straw, the precise moisture content needed for a proper pied-à-terre construction. He had spent his life raising warm, dry cottages from the very soil their owners farmed, using techniques passed down for 1,000 years. His tools were not saws and axes, but tampers, forms, and a deep, instinctual knowledge of geology and solar orientation. He had come to Nevada with his wife, Elżbieta, and their 2 small children, Jan and Zofia, drawn by the same vague promises of land and opportunity that pulled so many from the tired soils of Europe. They arrived late in the season of 1877 and hastily erected a small log cabin, built to the exact specifications of their neighbors. It was a tight, well-chinked structure of the kind celebrated in the pamphlets sent back east. It was also a torture chamber. Their first winter in the Sweetwater Valley was a lesson in a new kind of cold. This wasn't the damp, clinging chill of the Carpathians. It was a dry, predatory cold that seemed to radiate out of the very fabric of the universe. The sun would shine brightly in a clear sky, giving the illusion of warmth, but the moment it dipped behind the mountains, the temperature would plummet 30, 40, even 50 degrees. Their log cabin, for all its stout appearance, was a sieve. The thin walls of 10-inch pine logs had almost no capacity to hold heat. The warmth from their small stove radiated outwards and was lost to the night sky in minutes. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the stove glowing cherry red, while the corners of the single room remained frigid. Elżbieta would find the ink in the bottle on their small writing desk skinned over with ice each morning, a black frozen disk. One morning, the wool blanket covering the children had frozen fast to the interior wall, where condensation had turned to a sheet of rime ice. Peeling it away tore splinters from the log. They lived in a perpetual state of shivering, huddled in coats and blankets. Their world shrunk to the few feet of convection rising from the iron stove. Kazimierz watched his children's faces grow pale and pinched, heard the dry cough that never seemed to leave his son's chest. He knew they would not survive another winter like that. He knew the problem wasn't the stove or the firewood. The problem was the container. The problem was the walls. The failure of the standard frontier log cabin in the high desert of the Great Basin was a matter of physics that its builders, for all their practical skill, fundamentally misunderstood. They brought with them a building tradition forged in the dense, humid forests of the East and of Northern Europe. In those climates, the primary enemy was dampness and a more moderate, consistent cold. A log wall was effective there. It shed rain, blocked wind, and its modest insulative properties were sufficient when the temperature differential between inside and out was rarely extreme. But the Great Basin was a different world. It operated under a different thermal regime. Here, the defining characteristic was the immense diurnal temperature swing. The air was thin and dry, with little water vapor to hold on to the day's heat. At 5,000 feet, the sun was intense, bathing the landscape in solar energy. But under clear, high-pressure skies, the moment the sun set, the Earth radiated all that energy back into the blackness of space. This phenomenon, known as a radiation freeze, created a uniquely penetrating cold. It wasn't a blizzard. It was a silent, invisible drain, pulling the heat out of every object. A log cabin wall, typically 8 to 12 inches thick, has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1 to 1.5 per inch. A 10-inch wall, then, had an R value of perhaps 12 or 15. More critically, it possessed very little thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. Wood, being relatively lightweight and porous, heats up quickly and cools down just as fast. So, when the sun went down and the temperature plunged to 10 below zero, the heat stored in the log walls of Jedediah Coombs's cabin was gone in less than an hour. The only thing standing between his family and the killing cold was the frantic, continuous burning of wood. The stove fought a losing battle against the constant, massive heat loss through the walls and the countless tiny air gaps that opened up as the green wood cured, shrinking and twisting in the dry air. The chinking would crack and fall out, and the wind, when it did blow, would knife through the gaps. For the settlers of the Sweetwater Valley, winter was a siege, and the currency of survival was the cordwood they had spent their autumns cutting and stacking. They were fighting a war of thermodynamics they were destined to lose every single night, only to start the battle anew at dawn. Kazimierz saw this inefficiency with the eyes of a man whose entire craft was based on managing the slow, predictable migration of heat through dense materials. He watched his neighbors feed their stoves and knew they weren't warming their homes. They were merely, and temporarily, warming the night air of Nevada. He knew another way was possible. In the spring, he found his answer. The abandoned Pony Express station sat on a slight rise, well drained and facing south. It was a wreck. The roof was gone, and parts of the wall had been weathered into gentle slopes. But the core was intact, a foundation of stone, and on top of it, the remains of 22-inch thick walls made of the earth itself. The original builders, likely soldiers or contractors from Utah, had used the Pise technique, but they had done it hastily, with poor material and without the deep craft Kazimierz possessed. That's why it had failed. But the idea, to him, was not foolish. It was brilliant, merely executed poorly. He spent nothing to acquire it. The land was unclaimed, the structure considered worthless. His work began not with an axe, but with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. He tested the local soil, mixing it with water, feeling the clay content between his fingers. He found a perfect deposit 50 yards away, a heavy clay loam, ideal for rammed earth. He spent weeks digging and piling his raw material, adding sand from the creek bed and straw from a neighbor's spent haystack. Pemberton Stoddard made his first critical visit during this phase. He found Kazimierz ankle-deep in a pit of mud, mixing the components with a hoe. "Wojtkiewicz," Stoddard said, not unkindly, "I'm the freight agent. I can get you good milled lumber from the Sierra, delivered right to the spur. You could have a real house up before the ground freezes. What you're doing? It's what children do, making mud pies." "This is good earth," Kazimierz said simply, not looking up. "Strong." Once the mix was right, the real work began. He built sturdy wooden forms, 3 feet high and 10 feet long, and clamped them to the top of the eroded walls. Then, bucket by bucket, he and Elżbieta lifted the damp earth mixture into the forms. He would layer in about 6 inches, then begin tamping. The sound echoed his work from the old country, a deep, resonant thud as the heavy iron tamper compacted the soil, squeezing out air and water, turning a loose pile of dirt into a monolithic, stone-like material. It was brutally hard, slow labor. A single 10-foot section of wall, raised 3 feet, could take 2 full days of mixing, lifting, and tamping. It was during this tamping process that Jedediah Coombs and 2 other men stopped by. They watched in silence for 10 minutes as Kazimierz, stripped to the waist, his back muscles cording with effort, relentlessly pounded the earth inside the forms. Finally, Coombs shook his head. "You're building a wall out of the one thing that turns to soup in the rain. Pemberton is right. Stations were abandoned for a reason. Earth slumps and runoff, it gets saturated, and it's nothing but mud by April. You're building your own grave, Pole." Kazimierz paused, resting on his tamper. He looked at the sky, then at the careful stone foundation of the old station. He looked at the wide overhang he planned for the roof. "The roof will be good," he said. "A house needs good boots and a good hat." He then returned to his work. Thump, thump, thump. The conversation was over. His wife, Elżbieta, had her own quiet concerns. One evening, as they sat by their fire, she touched his bruised hands. "It looks so plain, Kazimierz, so heavy. People talk." "Let them talk," he said softly in Polish. "It is not a house for looking at. It is a house for living in. It will be a warm house. It will be a quiet house." By late September, the walls were complete. A seamless, 22-inch thick monolith of packed earth standing 5 feet tall on the stone foundation. He topped it with a heavy timber roof structure he salvaged from a collapsed mining shed, extending the eaves out a full 3 feet on all sides. The good hat he had spoken of. This was critical. The deep overhangs would protect the earthen walls from the vast majority of rain and snow melt, preventing the erosion that had doomed the original structure. Inside, he didn't build new walls. He took the thick, solid wood partitions from the original horse stalls and repurposed them as dividers, creating a main living area and 2 small sleeping spaces. The floor remained packed earth, hard as concrete, which he would later cover with rugs Elżbieta wove. The house was not beautiful. It was primal. It looked as if it had grown out of the ground it stood on. To understand why Kazimierz Wojtkiewicz was willing to bet his family's survival on a house made of dirt, you have to understand a principle that seems, at first, counterintuitive. You have to understand thermal mass and the physics of the time lag. His neighbors, like Pemberton Stoddard and Jedediah Coombs, thought about walls in terms of insulation alone, the ability to resist the flow of heat. On that measure, rammed earth is not a spectacular performer. Inch for inch, it has a lower R value than wood. A 22-inch rammed earth wall might have an R value of only about R5 or R6, far less than a well-built log wall. If the battle was about resistance, Kazimierz was losing, but he wasn't fighting a battle of resistance. He was playing a game of time. The key property of his 22-inch wall was not its R value, but its tremendous thermal mass. A single square foot of his wall weighed over 250 pounds. It was incredibly dense. Think of it like a boulder next to a campfire. The side facing the fire gets hot, but it takes a very, very long time for that heat to travel through to the other side. The boulder acts as a thermal battery, slowly absorbing and storing the energy. Long after the fire has died to embers, the boulder continues to radiate a gentle, steady warmth. Kazimierz' cabin was designed to be a massive, habitable boulder. During the day, the intense Nevada sun would beat down on the south and west-facing walls. For hours, the solar energy, thousands of BTUs of free heat, would pour into the outer few inches of the earth. But because of the wall's density and thickness, that pulse of heat would travel inward at a snail's pace, moving through the compacted earth at a rate of about 1 inch per hour. This created a thermal lag. The peak heat on the outside of the wall, occurring around 2 p.m., would take approximately 10 to 12 hours to migrate through the 22 inches of earth to the interior surface. This was the genius of the design. The heat from yesterday's afternoon sun would finally begin to radiate into the living space around midnight or 2 a.m., precisely when the outside air temperature was at its absolute lowest and the family needed the warmth most. The house became a giant passive heating system, smoothing out the violent temperature swings of the Great Basin. During the day, the massive walls would absorb heat from the sun and from the small cooking stove, keeping the interior from overheating. At night, they would slowly release that stored energy back into the room. The result was an astonishingly stable indoor environment. While the temperature outside might swing 50 degrees from a high of 40 to a low of -10, the temperature inside the earthen house would barely fluctuate more than 6 degrees, staying in a comfortable range without constant, furious heating. Kazimierz had built a thermal flywheel. His neighbors had built shields of paper. That November, winter fell on the Sweetwater Valley, not with a blizzard, but with a terrifying stillness. A massive dome of high pressure settled over the Great Basin, pushing out all clouds, all wind. For 10 straight days, the sky was a flawless pale blue, and for 10 straight nights the temperature plummeted under the perfectly clear sky as the earth radiated all its warmth into the void. This was the radiation freeze Kazimierz had anticipated. The official reading at the freight depot registered -29 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold that broke things. Axles on wagons contracted and seized. Great pines in the mountains cracked with reports like rifle shots as their sap froze solid. For the valley's residents in their log cabins, it was an ordeal. Jedediah Coombs's family was burning wood around the clock. The intense heat from the stove, combined with the extreme cold outside, was shrinking the logs of his 2-year-old cabin, opening up new cracks and gaps in the chinking. The cold didn't just seep in, it streamed in. They stuffed rags and even clothes into the gaps, but it was a losing fight. They lived in a bubble of heat 2 feet from the stove, wearing every layer of clothing they owned. The simple act of going to the woodpile was a painful, dangerous excursion. At the Wojtkiewicz home, life was normal. The small stove was lit in the morning for cooking and to add a bit of baseline heat to the walls, but by midday, it was often allowed to die down to coals. The sun, streaming through the south-facing windows, was the main furnace. The air inside was still and quiet. There were no drafts. Young Jan and Zofia played on a woven rug on the hard-packed earth floor, not in coats, but in their normal wool shirts. The temperature inside hovered at a steady 65 degrees. The most telling proof was a simple, domestic detail. On the deep, 22-inch wide inner windowsill, Elżbieta kept a small crock of lard for cooking. One morning, on the 4th day of the deep freeze, she went to scoop some out for the breakfast skillet. The spoon slid in easily. The lard was perfectly soft, malleable. Later that day, she had to go to the freight depot to pick up a parcel. In the unheated depot office, Pemberton Stoddard also had a crock of lard, kept for greasing wagon axles. When he went to get some, he had to take a knife and chip away at it, the white fat fracturing like a bar of cold soap. That small sensory contrast was everything. It was the difference between a home that stored warmth and one that was merely a porous container for a fire. On the afternoon of the 8th day of the freeze, Pemberton Stoddard had business that took him up the valley. A notice of a delayed shipment had come in for a teamster who was known to winter his stock in the upper meadows, not far from the old Pony Express station. Stoddard tacked a copy at the depot, but on the chance the man was isolated by the cold, he decided to ride up and post another notice on a fence post near what he still thought of as the Pole's mud pile. He rode wrapped in a buffalo coat, his beard stiff with frozen breath. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press in from all sides. The sun was low in the southwest, its light thin and powerless. He approached the station from the south. It looked inert, half buried in snowdrifts, with only a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. He felt a familiar pang of pity and frustration. The poor, stubborn fool. He and his family were probably huddled inside, freezing in the dark. He dismounted, his boots crunching loudly in the crystalline snow. The sun had been off the south-facing wall for at least 2 hours. In his experience, any surface not in direct sunlight was now the same temperature as the air, a vicious, skin-sticking cold. He pulled a nail and the notice from his pocket, his gloved fingers clumsy. He walked toward a wooden post that marked the edge of the property. As he did, he stumbled slightly, and his bare right hand, which he'd pulled from its glove to handle the nail, brushed against the flat, vertical surface of the earthen wall. He flinched, expecting a shock of brutal cold, the kind that feels like a burn. But he felt nothing of the sort. He stopped. Confused, he turned back to the wall. He stared at it. It was just earth, a dull brown, textured with bits of straw. Hesitantly, he reached out and placed his ungloved palm flat against it. The sensation sent a jolt through his entire body. The wall was warm. It was not hot, not like a stove. It was a deep, gentle, radiating warmth, like a sun-baked stone, hours after sunset. He pressed his face closer. He could feel the heat on his cheek. He slid his hand along the surface. The entire wall was breathing warmth into the -20-degree air. It was impossible. It defied every law of winter he had ever known. A wall should be the coldest part of a house, the boundary where the heat died. This wall was a source of heat itself. He stood there for a full minute, his palm pressed to the earth, his mind reeling. The mockery, the confident predictions of failure, the entire consensus of the valley, it all crumbled into dust in the face of this simple, physical fact. The wall was warm. He forgot about the notice. He walked to the simple plank door and knocked. When Kazimierz opened it, a wave of stable, gentle warmth washed over Stoddard, a warmth that carried the faint, pleasant smells of baked bread and wood smoke. It was not the scorching, dry blast of an overdriven stove, but the soft, encompassing warmth of a mild spring day. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw Elżbieta knitting in a chair, wearing only a shawl over her dress. He looked back at his own hand, then at the thick wall, then at the quiet man in the doorway. "Wojtkiewicz," Stoddard said, his voice hoarse. "Your wall? Dear God, it's warm." Kazimierz nodded, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "It is the afternoon sun," he said, "from yesterday." In that moment, Pemberton Stoddard understood. He didn't understand the physics in detail, not yet. But he understood the result. The mockery had been born of ignorance. The confidence had been misplaced. This quiet foreigner, with his primitive methods, had built not just a cabin, but a machine for living. He had built something that worked. Stoddard didn't apologize. Words weren't necessary. He simply looked at Kazimierz with a new, profound respect. "You didn't build a wall," Stoddard said, more to himself than to the Pole. "You built a season." The conversion of Pemberton Stoddard was the turning point. He was a man of commerce, a hub of information. His word carried weight. The story of the warm wall began to circulate, not as a joke, but as a genuine curiosity. The vehicle for its spread was the network of teamsters who passed through the freight depot. They were practical men who spent their lives exposed to the elements, men for whom warmth was not a luxury, but a matter of life and death. Stoddard would tell the story to a driver waiting for a load, and the next day that driver, a man named Silas Blackwood, would make a 2-hour detour on his route to Elko just to see for himself. He'd ride up to the station, dismount, and with a kind of ritual reverence, place his hand on the south wall in the late afternoon. He'd feel the impossible warmth, shake his head in wonder, and spend a few minutes talking with Kazimierz, who would patiently explain the principle, sketching in the dirt with a stick. Blackwood would then carry the story to the next way station, and the grapevine would grow. Men from 4 counties began to make the pilgrimage to the Sweetwater Valley. They didn't come for blueprints or complicated instructions. They were men of the physical world. They would measure the wall's thickness with their own hands, from the tip of their middle finger to their elbow. They'd crumble the local soil, asking about the right feel, the right amount of straw. Kazimierz shared his knowledge freely. Without pride or payment, he saw it as simple common sense. That spring, 4 new structures began to rise in the region, none of them made of logs. A rancher near Austin, a blacksmith in Eureka, and 2 homesteading families in the Reese River Valley all began digging, mixing, and tamping. They built ugly, thick-walled houses that looked more like fortifications than homes. And the next winter, their woodpiles lasted twice as long, and their children slept through the night without shivering. The revolution was quiet, slow, and made of mud. What Kazimierz Wojtkiewicz had brought to the Nevada frontier was a piece of ancient empirical science. He didn't have the language of modern building physics, but he had a perfect working knowledge of the results. A century later, engineers and architects would give formal names to the principles he employed. They would call it passive solar design. They would design and study Trombe walls, thick, sun-facing thermal mass walls and calculate their efficiency with complex computer models. They would champion the use of high thermal mass materials like concrete, stone, and adobe in climates with large diurnal temperature swings, recognizing it as a cornerstone of energy-efficient building. Kazimierz, with his tamper and his Carpathian craft, had anticipated it all. He had built a structure that was not merely a shelter, but an active, breathing part of the landscape's thermal cycle. The lesson of the rammed Earth station is a profound one. The conventional wisdom of the valley, embodied by the log cabin, was based on a logic of confrontation. A wall was a barrier, a shield to hold the cold at bay. It was a constant, hour-by-hour fight, pitting the stored energy of firewood against the relentless drain of the winter night. But that fight was exhausting and ultimately inefficient. Kazimierz understood a different logic, one of accommodation and delay. His wall didn't try to win a fight it couldn't win. It simply changed the timing of the engagement. It absorbed the free and limitless energy of the sun and held it in reserve, releasing it precisely when the enemy was at its strongest. He didn't build a wall to block the cold. He built one slow enough to outlast the night. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the innovators who shaped our world in quiet, profound ways. And tell us in the comments, what modern technology do you think owes a debt to an ancient, low-tech idea? The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, inspired by historical practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real-world examples of vernacular architecture. Anyone attempting to apply these or similar building techniques today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or construction advice.